Masechet Menaḥot Daf Ayin Tet. We're at the Mishnah at the bottom of the previous daf. The Mishnah teaches Shechata chutz lizmana vechutz limkoma kadash halechem. Shechata v'nimset terefa lo kadash halechem. We're talking about a korban todah, and we learned that when you do shechita on the korban todah, that act of shechita also sanctifies the 40 loaves that are going to be somewhere, either in the courtyard or somewhere nearby, in the walls of Jerusalem, wherever they are. So doing the shechita makes them sanctified. Once those loaves are sanctified, then, assuming it's a proper korban, then you finish finish preparing the korban, and then you eat the loaves together with the meat that is permitted to eat. Very good. Then that would be excellent. However, if one sanctifies the loaves and then something goes wrong with the sacrifice, then those loaves will be invalid, pasul, and you won't be able to use them again. If the loaves never became sanctified, as we'll see, then the loaves could be used for a different korban todah. Okay, so here's some different scenarios. If one did shechita on the animal of the korban todah and had in mind that he's going to consume the sacrifice outside of the time, at the wrong time, or outside the place, like outside the walls of Yerushalayim. In that case, even though the shechita makes it invalid, in fact, if it's chutz lizmana, then it becomes pigul, chayav karet. If it's chusum koma, then it's not chayav karet, it's just pasul. Even though this makes the sacrifice invalid, nevertheless, that shechita is valid enough that the 40 loaves become consecrated. Now, this is not really a good thing that it became consecrated, because it's consecrated, but the loaves are pasul. If you had chusim lizmana intention and one eats the loaves, then they are pigul and would be chayav karet. If one had chusim koma intention, no chayav karet, but still prohibited and pasul. And so this is actually not a good situation. Now, if he did shechita, and then after shechita, as he's checking the animal, turns out it was a terefa, had a hole in the lung. It was not going to live 12 months. In that case, the loaves do not become kadosh. The Gemara will explain that the fundamental difference here is that what we want to look at is whether the animal was already problematic from before shechita, or whether it became invalid at the time of shechita. If it turns out it was a terefa, that means it was a terefa even before the shechita. So therefore, you see, this animal was invalid all along. Now, you have to open it up to see, so you have to do shechita to be able to kill it, so you can see inside. But in fact, it was pasul from to begin with, and therefore that shechita never was an actual shechita, so the loaves never became sanctified. However, when the animal's perfectly good, and it's the shechita itself that's done in the wrong way because it's improper intention, then the shechita is still a valid shechita. It's an act of shechita. Now, it makes the korban invalid, but it is sufficient to make the bread holy. The bread is holy, even though it's also pasul. Next case, shechata nimset ba'alat mum. Rabbi Eliezer omer kidesh. Hachamim omrim lo kidesh. If you do shechita and then you find out it has a blemish, Rabbi Eliezer says it does become sanctified. Chachamim say it does not become sanctified. Now, in a case where it has a blemish, that seems to be the same as terefa. It had the blemish even before. So we understand Chachamim that would say lo kidesh. That would make a lot of sense. What is the reason for the Rabbi Eliezer that says it is sanctified? The Gemara will discuss this and will say it's talking about a case where the blemish is not so serious, and that it's such a case where even if lechatechila, one cannot burn the meat of that sacrifice, b'diavad, if you put it on the mizbeach, it's okay. So therefore, since it's a type of mum that b'diavad is okay, therefore Rabbi Eliezer rules that the loaves are sanctified. Shechata shelo lishma, v'chen ela miluim, v'chen shenei chibsei aser shechatan shelo lishman, lo kadash alechem. If one does shechita on the korban todah, but one has in mind for another type of offering. So if you have shelo lishma, then the loaves do not become sanctified. Now, even though this is a problem with the shechita itself, it wasn't a problem before, this is a different issue because you have in mind that you're doing shechita on as a korban hatat, korban asham, some other type of korban. Well, some other type of korban doesn't have loaves that are associated with it. So there's no mechanism by which this could sanctify the loaves. So therefore the loaves are not sanctified. So that's true of a korban todah. You do this korban todah, have in mind it's a hatat or something. Okay, so then the loaves do not become sanctified. And that's also true for other types of korbanot that have loaves that are associated with it, where the shechita would make those loaves sanctified. You have Ela Miluim. During the inauguration of the Mishkan, you had an ayil that had loaves that were connected with it. And if one would do shechita on that ayil, at that time, this is a one-time only law, at the inauguration, one would have in mind that this is a different type of korban. The loaves do not become sanctified. And so too, every year on Shavuot, when you have the Tushteh HaLechem and the Kibsei HaSeret, they go along with them. If those Kibsei HaSeret, you do shechita on them, thinking that they are a chatat. Well, they're not a chatat, and if it was a chatat, it doesn't have loaves connected to it. So since you had the wrong intention, there's no way that the loaves can become sanctified. This Mishnah is missing another case that has loaves, and that's the Nazir. The Nazir brings a korban shelamim that has 20 loaves connected to it, which should be the same law. So it's curious that the Mishnah does not include that law. It should be the same. The Gemara will ask about that. Matnitin Maneh, Rabbi Meir. Who is the author of our Mishnah? The answer is Rabbi Meir. We're about to see a long baraita that's going to bring two versions of this machloket here between Rabbi Eliezer and Chachamim. So this baraita is first of all going to name who the Chachamim are, and it's also going to bring two interpretations of what exactly they are arguing about. So our Mishnah is the version of Rabbi Meir, which is presented first here. The Tanya, Zeh Kelal, Kol shepisu lo kodem shechita lo kadash alechem, pisu lo achar shechita kadash alechem. Baraita begins with the rule by which we can understand the distinction between the first two cases here. So this is very helpful. Anytime that the thing that makes it pasul was already there before the shechita, so for example, like it's a terefa, then the bread does not become sanctified. However, if the pasul occurs after the shechita, or even with the shechita, because you had intention to consume it outside the time or outside the place at the time of shechita, so then that pasul did not precede the shechita. Therefore, the shechita is considered valid enough that the bread does get sanctified, even though it will become pasul or even pigul. Shechata chutz lizmana v'chutz limkoma kadash alechem. Shechata v'nimset terefa lo kadash alechem. Then the Baraita says exactly what the beginning of our Mishnah says, that if one did shechita having intention to consume it after outside the time or outside the place, so that shechita is considered an act of shechita, and therefore the breads do become consecrated, although they will be pasul. If one does shechita and then turns out that it was a terefa animal, then this pasul was preceded the shechita, and therefore the loaves never became sanctified. You could use them again for the next korban todah. Shechata v'nimset ba'alat mum. Rabbi Eliezer omer kadash. Rabbi Yoshua omer lo kadash. Rabbi Meir. If you do shechita and then you find that it has a blemish, Rabbi Eliezer says it nevertheless is sanctified. Rabbi Yoshua says not sanctified. All this is a version of the machloket according to Rabbi Meir. This fits with our Mishnah exactly. The only little difference is that the Mishnah says Chachamim, and here in the Baraita says Rabbi Yoshua. So in fact, it must be that in fact it was Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he codified the Mishnah, he would take the minority opinion that he believed should be the halacha l'maaseh and made it the majority and called the Chachamim. So here now we know that Chachamim was originally Rabbi Yoshua. But all this fits precisely to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is a later Tana, a fourth generation Tana, and he is giving his version of what the previous Tanaim, these are the sages that are a couple of generations before him, this is what they were arguing about. As it says in the Mishnah, they were arguing about Baal Mum. All right, good. Now, the Baraita continues with now a different view. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is a colleague of Rabbi Meir. They're both students of Rabbi Akiva, and he has a different understanding. Lo nechleku Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua al sheshechatav nimset terefa shelo kadash ve'al chusim komo shekadash ve'al ba'amum shelo kadash ve'al ma nechleku al chusim komo sheRabbi Eliezer mer kadash Rabbi Yoshua mer lo kadash. Rabbi Yehuda says that there is no difference of opinion between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua regarding a case where he did shechita and it turns out to be a terefa. There, that the loaves do not become holy. That's an agreement with Rabbi Meir too. And they both agree that if you did shechita having intention outside of the time, that the loaves do become sanctified. That also is the same as Rabbi Meir. And they also do not agree regarding if it turns out that it had a blemish, then it is not sanctified. This is interesting because Rabbi Meir's version said that according to Rabbi Yoshua, who is Chachamim, they're lo kidesh. According to the Yehuda, everybody agrees that Baal Mum lo kidesh. So here's already one difference. Now, if they do not argue in the case of Baal Mum, so what do they argue about? Oh, they argue about a case of chuslim koma. According to the Rabbi Meir, if it's chuslim koma, the Rabbi Meir thought that chuslim koma is the same as chuslis mano and kidesh. However, according to the Yehuda, he says that this is the machloket. Rabbi Eliezer says that chuslim koma is kidesh, meaning that's the same as chuslis mano. And Rabbi Yoshua says, lo kidesh. So Rabbi Yoshua, for some reason, makes a distinction between chuslim komo and chuslis mano. Chuslis mano, kidesh. Chuslim komo, when he has intention, while he's doing shechita on the animal, to consume it outside of the place, Rabbi Yoshua thinks that the loaves do not become consecrated. All right, now let's see why. The Braita continues with the conversation between them. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, hoil v'chuslis mano pasul, v'chuslim komo pasul, ma chuslim komo kidesh, af chuslim komo kidesh. Rabbi Eliezer says, very reasonably, since if you have intention outside of the time, it's pasul, and outside of the place, it's also pasul. So just like if you have intention outside the place, the loaves nevertheless do become consecrated. So too, if you have intention during shechita that to consume it outside the place, also it should be the same thing. Fine. These are both very similar. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, hoil v'chusum komo pasul, u'ba'amum pasul, ma ba'amum lo kidesh, af chusum komo lo kidesh. Rabbi Yoshua says, no, I don't have to compare those two. I can compare the following two things. Since if you do shechita with intention to consume it outside the place, it becomes pasul. Pasul, but no karet, right? Not pigul, just pasul. And also, if you do shechita and has a mum, also that's pasul. So these are the same outcomes, that the sacrifice itself becomes invalid. So therefore, just like if it turns out to have a blemish, lo kidesh, the loaves are not holy. So too, having intention outside the place, also the loaves should not become holy. So who said you should compare those two things? I'm going to compare the case of chuslim komo, not to chuslis mano, but rather to mum. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, ani dimitihu lechuslis mano, v'ata dimito leba'al mum. Nirei lemi domeh. Im domeh lechuslis mano, nidunenu mechuslis mano. Im domeh leba'al mum, nidunenu miba'al mum. So Rabbi Eliezer, before he makes his argument, first presents the ground rules. This is how we're going to decide. He says, listen, I compared chuslim komo to chuslis mano. You compared it to ba'al mum. So let's see. To which concept is it more similar? And we'll argue this out. If we find out that chuslim komo is more similar to chuslim mano, then we will derive the law from chuslim mano. And if we say it's more similar to ba'al mum, then I'll agree with you that it should derive the law from ba'al mum and lo kidesh. So here we go. Good. Now that they know the ground rules that we want to see conceptually which one is more similar to, and then we'll decide based on that. Okay, so itchil Rabbi Eliezer ladun. Rabbi Eliezer argues as follows: Danin pesul machshaba mi pesul machshaba, and danin pesul machshaba mi pesul haguf. It makes sense to bring an analogy between one law that is pasul because of thought to another law that's pasul because of thought. That is, pasul, thinking of it outside the place, should be similar to having intention to consume it outside of the time. Those should be the same. They're both problems in the thought that one has when doing shechita. And so therefore you should compare those two, and those then would both be kidesh alechem, and do not bring a case of ba'amum, because that has nothing to do with intention, but rather it's a physical problem. Look, it has this problem. It has a physical blemish. Okay, that makes sense. Hitchil, Rabbi Yoshua ladun. Rabbi Yoshua says, I have a counter. Danin pesul she'en bo karet mi pesul she'en bo karet. I'm going to compare two types of disqualifications where there's no karet. And that would be a problem of a mum. There's no karet. It's just pasul. And also having intention outside a place. Also no karet. Those two are more similar. And don't bring me the chus outside of the time intention, because there it has karet, so leave that out. That's a completely different category. And furthermore, I can counter what you said. Not only do I have a similarity that's equal to your similarity, I'm going to negate your similarity. You said that we should put it together because it's a problem that's caused by wrong intention. Oh yeah? Well, you know what? Mishelo lishma. If you do shechita on a korban todah, having in mind it's a korban hatat, that's also an issue of intention. And yet, remember, the Mishnah taught that the loaves do not become consecrated when you have wrong intention for the type of korban it is. Shelo lishma. They do not become consecrated. So you see that just because something is a problem in intention doesn't necessarily mean it should be the same as chus lizmano and it should be consecrated. Not true. So therefore, I will compare my case of chus limkomo to chus shelo lishmo, because both of those are in fact problems of thought, and there's no karet. So this is a very strong argument. Veshatak Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer had no counter to this. So the Gemara is going to assume that Rabbi Eliezer, because he had no counter, must have changed his mind and agreed with Rabbi Yoshua. Now, Rabbi Meir, my shena hashechata v'nimset terefa, tave pesulo kodem shechita. My shena shechata v'nimset ba'amum, telo have pesulo kodem shechita. We ask, according to Rabbi Meir, what is the difference between a case where you do shechita and it turns out to be terefa? Oh, there, the bread does not become consecrated because the pisul preceded the shechita. Well, in that case, what's the difference between that and the case where you do shechita and it turns out it had a blemish, and it had a blemish all along? Where in that case, the lohave pisulo kodem shechita. How come you do not consider that to be also a case where the pisul comes before the shechita, and also, therefore, it should be the same law that the loaves should not become consecrated, but it'd be in the Meir's version, according to the Rabbi Eliezer. In the case of Ba'amum, it turns out to be Ba'amum, the loaves are consecrated. So why? I mean, we said the rule. The rule is Pisulo Kodem Shechita. So in that case, the loaves should not be consecrated. So how come here this doesn't fit into that rule and say the same thing? And the answer is Bedukin Sheba'ayin V'alibad Rabbi Akiva Damar Im Alu Lo Yerdu. When the Mishnah said then you notice that it had a blemish, it's not talking about any blemish. If it was like a serious blemish, like missing a limb or something, then that's totally not good, and that was certainly there before shechita, and therefore the loaves would not be consecrated in that case. When the Mishnah says that, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the loaves are consecrated, it was talking about a specific case of a blemish that's in the cornea of the eye, looks like this, something like a cataract. Because in that case, it's a minor blemish. And according to Rabbi Akiva, even though lechatechila, one should not continue to offer such a sacrifice, if b'di'avad, you put it on the mizbeach, then you don't take it down. So since b'di'avad, it's okay, therefore that's valid enough that the loaves do become consecrated according to Rabbi Eliezer. This is all within the understanding of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yoshua, okay, now according to Rabbi Yoshua, if indeed it's talking about only the cataract in the eye, which b'diavad is okay, so how come Rabbi Yoshua says that the loaves do not become consecrated? And he'll say, Ki amar Rabbi Akiva, im alu lo yirdu b'fsula de gufeh, aval kiddush lechem la. Rabbi Yoshua will say, when Rabbi Akiva said that when it's just a cataract in the eye, then if you take the sacrificial meat of the animal and put it on the mizbeach, b'diavad, you leave it there and you don't take it down. That's only talking about the disqualification of the offering itself, the body of the animal itself. Fine, you put it up there, okay, leave it there. But that doesn't mean that it's valid enough that it will also sanctify the bread. The bread is not part of the animal. Okay, so that you did shechita, okay, it's valid enough. It's a minor blemish, so it's valid enough. It's okay enough that b'diavad, okay, let it stay on there. But it's not valid enough that something that's not part of the animal, those loaves, now going to become consecrated? No, he does not agree with that. Itmar, chatat shechata chus lizmana, imarta lo tered. Chus limkoma, Rava amar tered, Rabba amar lo tered. Now we're going to relate what we just learned in the Braita above to a machloket amoraim in the following case. So it was taught that if you have a korban chatat and you do shechita with intention to consume it outside of the time, well, in that case, it's pasul. But b'di'avad, if you put the sacrificial parts on the mizbeach, you can leave them there. Okay, that's for chutz lizmana. Now, however, if you have a korban chatat and you do shechita with intention to consume it outside of the place, in that case, it's a machloket amoraim. Rava says, bring it down. Rabba, his teacher, says, you do not take it down, you leave it on the mizbeach. Now we're going to correlate these two opinions of these Amoraim with the two Tanaim that we just had above. Rava ke Rabbi Yoshua, Rabba ke Rabbi Eliezer. We're going to say that Rava follows Rabbi Yoshua. How so? Well, Rabbi Yoshua taught that if you have intention outside of the place, that's the same as finding a blemish. And if you found a blemish in an animal and you put it up, then you take it down. So therefore, since intention to consume outside the place is the same as a blemish, therefore also, if you have intention outside of the place, you have to take it down. That's why Rava said, take it down. And Abba, he would follow the equation of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said that if you have intention, wrong intention for the place, then that's the same as having wrong intention for time. And if you had wrong intention, you have intention to eat it outside of the time, then you, b'diavad, if you put it up, you leave it there. So too, if you have intention to consume it outside of the place, if you leave it up, then you leave it there. And that's why Rabba said, lo tered. So we can line them up. Vehadar be Rabba legabe Rava. Mehadar be Rabbi Eliezer legabe Rabbi Yoshua. And it must be that Rabba retracted his opinion and ended up agreeing with Rava. How do you know? Because as we saw at the end of the Braita, when we had the conversation between them, Rabbi Eliezer had no answer, shatak. And therefore it must be that he changed his mind and agreed with Rabbi Yoshua. So if Rabbi Eliezer ended up agreeing with Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbah was following Rabbi Eliezer in the first place, then it must be Rabbah would change his mind and agree with Rava. Or another version of this discussion is, it could be that even though Rabbi Eliezer changed his mind and ended up agreeing with Rabbi Yoshua, Rabba did not change his mind and agree with Rava. Actually, this makes more sense because these Amoraim live a long time after those Tanaim, so they would have already known that Rabbi Eliezer changed his mind. And if he already knew that, Rabba already knew that, but still stated his opinion, so that means he didn't change his mind regarding this case. Why? Hatam hu dekamar le nidunenu mishelo lishmo avalacha idainat le mishelo lishmo imalta lo tered. How did Rabbi Yoshua best Rabbi Eliezer and refute him? Because remember, Rabbi Yoshua said, well, let's compare two things that have a problem with thought. And we'll compare thought of outside of the place with doing shechita with intention for a different type of korban. And he says, well, if you do it with a different type of korban, then the bread is not sanctified. So also outside the place, the bread is not sanctified. So that's how he did it in that case. That's how Rabbi Yoshua beat Rabbi Eliezer. However, if you would apply the same thing in our case, a korban hatat, if you slaughter it with the intention of something else, of a different type of korban, and b'diavad you put it up, you leave it there. It does not come down. So you see that Rabbah would say that even though Rabbi Eliezer changed his mind, that challenge of Rabbi Yoshua against Rabbi Eliezer only applied to the case of whether or not the bread becomes sanctified. But his challenge of comparing it to Shelo Lishmo, once we apply it to the Korban Hatat, in fact, fine. So we'll compare it to another thing that is a problem with intention. So the wrong intention of place, yes, I agree, will be like the wrong intention of the type of korban shelo lishma, but in the case of korban hatat, if you did shechita shelo lishma, then and you put it up b'diavad, it does not come down, and so therefore Rabbah will stick with his opinion and say so too. If you do shechita of the korban hatat having intention that it's outside of the place, then in fact yes, it will be the same as if you did outside the time, and the same as if you did the shechita and the korban hatat shelo lishma. In all those cases, if you put it up there, it does not come down. So Rabbah will stick with his opinion. Lastly, for this Mishnah, shechita shelo lishma, the Mishnah said, if you do shechita not for its sake, then the breads do not become sanctified. And it brought examples of other types of korbanot that would be linked to breads. Amar Papa Shebak Tana Didan El Nazir Teshchiach Venakit Ela Miluim. The Papa wonders, why did the author of our Mishnah leave off the ayil of a Nazir, which happens often. Whenever there's a Nazir, he's going to have to bring an ayil that comes with the 20 loaves. And he left that out, and instead he brought the Miluim case, which happens only once in history, when they sanctified the Mishkan. So it's curious why he brought the El Miluim and left out El Nazir. So we in fact wonder, V'tana didam, what is the reasoning of the author of our Mishnah? How would we answer the Papa? And the answer is Ikad mileta nakat. He wanted to teach the primary matter, the first time that there was an offering that was brought with loaves. That was important for him to include, and then you can figure out its application also to the El Nazir. The next Mishnah now turns to wine libations. So just like where some sacrifices have loaves that are connected to it, and the loaves become sanctified during shechita, so too other sacrifices have a wine libation that's connected to it, and the wine also will become sanctified. And so this Mishnah teaches, Hanesachim shekadshu bikli v'nimsa zevach pasul im yesh zevach acher yakribo imo v'im lav yipasilu belina. If you had a libation of wine that became sanctified in a temple vessel, and it will become somewhat sanctified just when you put it in a temple vessel. It gets a level of sanctity, but then it gets a higher level of sanctity when you do shechita on the animal, and it connects it together with that animal. And then if it turns out that korban is pasul, it's no good. So now what are you going to do with that wine? You can't use that wine for this korban because this animal is not good. So the answer is it depends. If there is another animal, korban, that is valid, so then we'll switch it and we'll use the wine as a libation for the valid animal. And if not, there's no other animals today, what are we going to do? Well, there's a problem. This wine has already been sanctified. Once it's sanctified, it has to be used only on that day. So we leave it overnight and then it's burned. You can't use it on the next day. Ziri says that wine libations become fully consecrated only when you do shechita on the animal offering. My ta'ama, what's the source? Amar kera zebach unsachim. Because the pasuk says first the zebach referring to the sacrifice that you slaughter, and then once you slaughter nesachim, then the wine is considered fully consecrated and then will not be able to be used on the next day And Gemara will discuss why you can use it for a different korban, but certainly you cannot use it on a different day once it is fully sanctified. Tenan. Now we're going to ask a question against the Iri from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah taught, "Hanesachim shekadshu bekli v'nimsa zerach pasul. Em yesh zebach acher yikrebu imo v'im lav yipaslu be'lina." If you have some wine and it became consecrated when you did shechita on the animal in the temple, in the vessel that it's in, and it turns out that when you do shechita, that korban is pasul, then you see, if there's another korban, then we can use the wine for that. If not, then we'll have to leave it till the next day and burn it. Now, what do you mean that it became pasul? How did the zevach become pasul? My love, the ifsil b'shechita. Wouldn't it be a case where you did shechita in the wrong way, some had wrong intention or something wrong during shechita, and because of that, the animal became pasul? If so, then the wine should never have become sanctified in the first place, because Zeiri, you said that the wine only becomes sanctified with the shechita. But if the shechita was no good, then the wine should also not be sanctified, and therefore there's no reason why you should have to leave it over to the next day. If the shechita was not valid, then the wine will not have become consecrated, and if the wine is not consecrated, then you can leave it till tomorrow, leave it till next week, and use it whenever you want for the next korban. It will have some level of holiness because it's in a vessel, so you can't just drink it yourself, but you don't have to use it on that day if it was not sanctified yet through shechita. So isn't that a challenge against Zeiri? And the answer is no. La difsil bezirika. We're talking about a case where you did shechita on the animal and the shechita was perfectly good. You had proper intention. Everything was good. And therefore, since it's become sanctified with the shechita, the wine is now fully sanctified. Then later on, when you took the animal's blood and you did zirika, you had some improper intention during the zirika, and that made it pasul. Well, now you can no longer use that wine for this korban because this korban is pasul. It became pasul in zirika, and that's fully sanctified already from shechita. That's what the Mishnah is talking about, where you could still use this wine for a libation for another animal. Otherwise, you would have to wait till it's overnight and throw it out. Keman, this Mishnah, with this interpretation, who would it follow? Kedebi, it would follow the Biyuda Nasi. Damar, Shene Devarim Amatirim, Ma'alin Ze, Belo Ze. The B said that anytime you have a case of two matirin, so that would be like a korban, where in order to permit the permitted parts of the korban and any things that are associated with it, to permit those things for being consumed, you need shechita and zirika. Only after you do shechita and zirika, and you do it properly, then you can consume the meat. Then you can consume the loaves, whatever else you're consuming. If you have a case where you have two things that are matirin, even though you need both things in order to permit those to be permitters, nevertheless, if you did one of them as in a proper way, it elevates the other thing to a sanctified status. So that's to be here, even though you would need both shechita and zirika to permit the rest of the parts of the korban. Even if you only did one without the other, just did shechita, it would already make the wine sanctified. So the wine becomes fully sanctified with the shechita, and then doing the zirika the wrong way will ruin the animal, but the wine is still sanctified. So that the explanation we said above is perfectly fine. It will not fit, however, with the counterpart of Rabbi. The one who disagrees with Rabbi is Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. He says that something will not become sanctified if you require two matirin to permit it, then it will require both of those activities in order to sanctify it, which in this case, if you had wrong intention during the sprinkling, and the sprinkling is no good, and then the animal is no good, then in that case, the sanctification of the wine also will never have happened. And therefore, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon, you should not have to pour out the wine wait till tomorrow and destroy it, because it will never have been sanctified if the zirika was no good. So that's what it would seem. But then we say, no, it could be afilu tema Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. We can even explain everything we just did, even according to Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, if we limit to a particular case. Bakos v'nishpach. We're talking about a case where you did shechita properly, and then you received the blood in a cup properly, and then on the way, taking it to the mizbech to do the sprinkling, it spilled out, and that's why there was no sprinkling. It's true, there was no sprinkling, but according to him, if you couldn't do the sprinkling because it spilled out, it's as if you did the sprinkling, as we say now. Rabbi Elazar agrees with his father, Rabbi Shimon. Any blood that could have been sprinkled, everything was okay, even if it was not physically sprinkled because it spilled on the floor. It's as if it was sprinkled, at least as far as the law is for sanctifying the wine. So in order to sanctify the wine, you're right, you need both matirim. You have to do the shechita and the zirika, but you don't actually have to do the zirika. As long as you could have done the zirika, because everything else was good, but it spilled, that's sufficient to sanctify the wine. And so we can say our Mishnah is also the opinion of Rabbi Elazar be Rabbi Shimon. Amar Mor, Im yesh zebach acher yikrebu imo. Now we requote the Mishnah that says that if there is another korban around on that same day, then you can use the wine libation for that one. You had some wine libation that became consecrated, but turned out that the first korban that was designated for became pasul, so we can't use it for that. That's okay. We can switch it and use the wine libation for another animal sacrifice on the same day. We ask, V'ha'amar Rav Chisda, shemen shefrisho l'shum mincha zeh, pasul l'shum mincha acheret. Rav Chisda said that if you have oil that was set aside for a certain korban mincha, then if that korban mincha became pasul, you cannot use that oil for something else, for a different korban mincha. You had the oil, so I'm going to use it with this flour for a korban. Now, that flour became pasul. You can't use the oil for anything else, and therefore it should be the same law here. I had wine, it became consecrated, connected with korban A. Now korban A is no good. How could you use the oil, that same wine, for a different korban? Amar Rabbi Yanai, le betin matne alehem, im usrechu, im lav, yehu lezebach acher. Rabbi Yanai explains that when it comes to wine, that bet din's mind, even if they don't say it explicitly every time, they make a general stipulation that says, this wine, whatever wine, anytime you have wine that becomes consecrated through putting it in a vessel and doing shechita, if it's required and will be used for this korban, good. And if not, if something happens to the korban and ends up being pasul, like the zirika was not with the proper intention, then we make a stipulation that retroactively that wine will be okay for a different sacrifice, and so therefore that consecration and connection with this sacrifice never went through, and really then you can use it for a different sacrifice. So it's because of this stipulation of the court, that's why you can use this wine for a different korban. We ask, well, if the court makes a stipulation like that for the wine, then why not for the oil also? And say, this oil, anytime someone says, this oil is going to be for this korban mincha, we should say an implicit stipulation by the Beit Din. If something goes wrong, then use the oil for another one. So use the same mechanism. And the answer is no, you cannot, because shemen gufat minchahu. Oil is an integral part of a korban mincha. It's one of the main ingredients. You need flour, you need oil. Whereas the libation is an accompaniment. The animal is the main thing, and then wine is an accompaniment. So for wine, you can make a stipulation. Okay, if it's not used for this, we'll use it for something else. But oil is one of the main ingredients, and you can't just use it for something else. We ask, Velitnu alehen denifku leholin. Back to the wine. Why does the court, if you're going to stipulate something, so make a stronger stipulation? Why does it say, if it won't be used for this korban, it will be used for a different korban? Why not say, if it can't be used for this korban, then let it go back to cholin. Let it go back to just plain wine. So then you could take it back home. And that would save us trouble, because we said in the Mishnah, if you designate wine for this korban and it ends up being pasul and there's no other korban on that day, then you have to wait till overnight and then burn it. Well, why should we have to do that? If you're making a stipulation anyway, make a stronger stipulation that if this wine will be used, good. If it won't be used for this korban, then let it not have been sanctified ever. And then we won't have to throw it out. Gezerah shema yomeru mosin mikeli sharet dachol. Oh, the answer is it's a gezerah. If people seeing this and they'll see, oh look, this wine was consecrated in temple vessel, it was shechita, and it was consecrated, and now look. Now they're taking it, he's taking it back home and you're drinking it at home. Oh, I guess you could put something in a sanctified vessel and then change your mind and take it home. People will get the wrong idea and they'll learn incorrectly that other cases of consecration can just be undone just like that. And they won't realize that's only because of a special stipulation in this case. So we don't do that so people won't get the wrong idea. We ask about the hashtan nameh gezerah shema yomru nesachim shefrishan neshum zevach zeh keshir neshum zevach acher. Even with this stipulation, people may get the wrong idea and they'll say, oh look, this guy, he brought this animal in and he brought that wine in and he did shechita, he put it in a vessel, did shechita and consecrated this wine, and then something wrong happened with the animal and now they just take this wine and they use it for something else. Oh, I guess you can do that. I guess you can separate wine for korban A and just change your mind to say, no, you know what? I want to use it for a different korban. But that's not allowed. If there's nothing wrong with korban A, you can't just change it and move it to something else. So people will get the wrong idea, even with this current stipulation. And the answer to that is, Hatani Matitya ben Yehuda, kegon sheya zebach zabuach beota sha'a. Matitya ben Yehuda says that in the Mishnah case that says you can use that wine for another libation, that's not talking about if it's an animal that was later in the day. Rather, it was talking about when there's another animal that's presented simultaneously. So at the same time, I have animal A, and there's another animal, animal B, and we're doing shechita at the same time. And therefore, I have my animal's animal A, and so I designate this wine that I brought. And then while we're doing it, turns out that someone does the sprinkling with the wrong intention, and now animal A is pasul. That's okay. You know what? Just switch the wine to animal B. Now, anyone looking, they don't know what our intention is. They don't know that I had in mind this wine for this animal. That wine is just sitting there. The animal's sitting there. And so anyone watching can equally assume that the animal was designated for animal B from the outset. And therefore, they will not come to make a mistake. Okay, we ask, Aval en zevach zavuach b'ota shamai. Now, what if there is no other animal slaughtered at the same time, but a slaughtered animal that we had? My animal was at 10 a.m. and then it became no good. And later on at 2 p.m., someone else brings an animal and starts with it. And then, in that case, what would you say about the wine that was left over from the 10 a.m. one that we never used? Can you use it for the 2 p.m. one? So what are you going to say? Oh, nifsal belina. So in that case, no, we have to leave it overnight. We can't use it for that because then people will get the wrong idea that you can switch wine from one to another. If so, adetane sefa imla v'pasul belina liflog v'litne bedida. B'amedrim amorim she'ayta zebach zavuach be'ota sha'a, aval en zebach zavuach be'ota sha'a la. If so, then the continuation of the Mishnah should not have read which it does read now. If not, if there's no other animal, then leave the wine overnight. Instead, it should bring a finer distinction and say, when do we say that you can use it for another korban on that day? If there was another korban that you did shechita at the same time. But if there was no other animal that was done at the same time, then no good. And if it was even that same day, but later in the day, then no, you have to leave it overnight. The Mishnah should have said so. And the answer to that is Hachinami ka'amad. That's what the Mishnah means to say. It meant to say, even though it said it in a short form, what it meant to say is, when do we say that you can use the same wine for another korban, only if that other korban was already there and you did shechita at the same time. But if not, ve'im lav means, and if not, if there's no other korban there at the same time that has shechita, then it will be, then we should treat it like something that is disqualified overnight, and you have to leave it overnight, and it's pasul, and you burn it afterwards. Umi'it Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar le'beit din matneh alehen. Earlier in the sugya, we said that we can reconcile our Mishnah with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon and his father, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. We said that we can reconcile it. But now, once we reach this conclusion, we go back to that reconciliation and we ask, in this interpretation that we have a condition of Beit Din, is that reconcilable with the opinion of, this is Rabbi Elazar's father, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. There's Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, and then Rabbi Elazar, his son. So, can we reconcile it with Rabbi Shimon, who we said before, yes, we are relying on him. Can we say that this section here that says there is a condition of Beit Din, is that reconcilable with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon? Amar Ravidi barabin, Amar Rav Amram, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Tamidim shelo sruchu lasibur, l'divrei Rabbi Shimon, and niftim timimim. L'divrei chachamim, niftim timimim. Rabbi Yochanan reported that if you have a korban tamid, meaning you have an animal that was set aside for a korban tamid. Remember, we learned that the 6 animals that we put in the chamber in the Beit HaMikdash to be used for korban tamid. So we always have 1 ready, 2 ready each day. So let's say you had a sheep that's set aside, sanctified to be a korban tamid, and in the end we didn't need it. No, they were extra. We had other ones, and we didn't end up using it. What are we going to do with this animal? According to the Rabbi Shimon, you cannot redeem it without a blemish. Rather, you let it go graze till it gets a blemish, and then you can redeem it. Hachamim, however, say you can redeem it even without a blemish. Just redeem it as is, use that money for a different korban, and let the animal go. So here we see that, what's the reason for Hachamim? How could you redeem it without a blemish? It must be that the Beit Din made a stipulation and said, listen, these 6 sheep here, we're going to use them for korban tamid. If we don't use them for korban tamid, we end up not needing it, then it's not sanctified. So that's why you can redeem it without making a blemish, because there was a stipulation. But Rabbi Shimon says you can't just redeem it. Rather, the same as if there's no stipulation, you have to wait till it grazes till it gets a blemish. Only then. So you see, Rabbi Shimon does not agree with Chachamim and does not have a stipulation. So that means that here, regarding the wine, also Rabbi Shimon would not have a stipulation. So how can he be reconciled with our Mishnah? And the answer is Shaneatam de'itlu takanta bere'aya. Rabbi Shimon, in fact, would say that a Beit Din does make a stipulation when it comes to wine, because with wine there's no other way to resolve the problem. Unlike with sheep, you can fix the sheep, you can get it back by letting it graze. So you have a simple solution. You don't have to rely on a stipulation. Rabbi Shimon says don't rely on a stipulation if you don't have to. With sheep, you can let it graze, get a blemish, and then you can redeem it afterwards, and that's without a stipulation. When it comes to wine, there's no blemish of wine. You can't let it go graze. There's nothing like that. Wine, if you don't do anything, if you don't make a stipulation, you're going to end up having to throw it out. And we don't want to have to just throw it out and burn it. It's nice, good wine. It's consecrated. We want to be able to use it. So when it comes to wine, even Rabbi Shimon would agree that the Beit Din makes a stipulation that if you're not going to use it for this animal, then you can still use it for another one. The next Mishnah teaches Velad Todah Utmurata. Hifrish Todah ve'abda v'hifrish acheret tachteha ena te'una lechem. Shenemar v'ekrib al zebach ha-todah te'una lechem ve'lo velada ve'lo chilufa ve'lo temurata te'unin lechem. We have 3 cases here. Number 1 is you set aside a korban todah, you sanctify it, and it happens to be a pregnant animal, and it gives birth. The offspring will also be holy as a korban todah. That's case number 1. You have 2 animals that are both designated as korban todah. Second case, if you try to exchange it. So I don't want to bring this animal as a todah, I want to change it for that one. The law is that both of them, first of all, you're not allowed to do that, and as a result, both animals are consecrated. Third case, if you have an original Korban Todah and then it got lost. So you separate a second one, but then you found the first one. So in all these three cases, you have two animals that are holy and have to be slaughtered as a Korban Todah. Nevertheless, you only have to bring one set of loaves for one of them. You pick one of them, and you say, that will be for my set of loaves. So, ena teuna lechem. The second one does not require breads, as the pasuk says, that he will sacrifice al zevach ha-todah. The todah, that means singular. A todah requires breads, but not its offspring does not require breads. And the one that you used for an exchange does not require. And the one that you brought as timura, as exchange, or the one that you lost and then you brought a substitute, that one, although you do have to slaughter it as a sacrifice, you do not have to bring 40 loaves with it. Tenor banan, mahu omer todah yakrib. Now a braita that expands on this idea, and was going to learn something from each of the parts of this pasuk. The pasuk says, Im al todah yakribenu, vehikrib al zebach hatodah chalot masot, and so on. So we have extra words here. I could have just said, Im al todah, then al zebach hatodah. What is this? Yakribenu, vehikrib. So what are we going to learn from all these words? So the Baraita says, Im al todah yakrib. In other words, notice that the pasuk actually is yakribenu, but we're going to learn something from yakrib, then we're going to learn something from the nu, so we're separating it out. Minayin lemafrish todah tova abda, v'ifrish acheret tachteha, v'nimset harishona, v'aresh sheten homdot, minayin she'eze mehen she'yirseh yakrib lachma ima. How do you know that if you separated an animal for Korban Todah and it got lost, and then you separated a second one for it, and you found the first one, and now you have two animals there, how do you know that you can pick any one you want, and you bring it and the loaves together with it? Talmud omad ha-todah yakrib. As it says, the todah, you bring offering. So as long as he sacrifices a thanks offering, then that's good enough. That he brings the loaves with that, and he's good to go. And the other one does not require loaves. Now you might think, fine, and now I know that if I have two, I pick one and bring loaves with it. That I know. But how do I know that maybe the second one, since it's also designated as a Korban Todah, maybe I have to bring a second set of loaves for that one? So in other words, Yakrib tells me that although I have two, I can take one and make it my regular Korban Todah with loaves. That's Yakrib. So Yakrib is an expansive word. But Yakribenu, to sacrifice it is a limiting word to say that only one gets loaves, and the other one, although I do shechita as a korban, it does not require loaves. So now that we see that the pasuk, it was inclusive and then exclusive. Inclusive that one of them will require loaves. Don't think that none of them get loaves now. No, one of them requires loaves, that's included. And the exclusion of nu tells me that not both. So now I only know for the case of if I lost one and got another one. How about all the other cases? Maybe not. Maybe those would be different, because if something is an offspring, maybe the offspring is more similar to the mother, and therefore maybe the offspring requires its own loaves. So how do I know that the same law is true for offspring and for replacement and for an exchange? That in all these cases I do have to offer both of them. Talmud omar im al todah. If on todah, so that means all of them, all these cases. That al todah. If anything is designated as a todah, I have to make it. Yachoyu tunim lechem. Now I might think that both of them have to bring breads. Talmud omar v'krib al zebach ha-todah. Todah teuna lechem velo velada velo chidufa velo timurata teunin lechem. That's why it says ha-todah. So this actually is getting back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah didn't quote all of these different derivations, but just this last one, ha-todah. That means a todah requires loaves, but not the offspring, no loaves for that, and not the replacement, and not the exchange. The second one will not require loaves. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.